some point as, quote, normal. They know what socialization is like. They like to be interacting with other people. And now because of a catastrophic illness, because of some type of an accident, they are listed as a traumatic brain injury. They just don't fit in. And we know that men are more abusive to women with disabilities than women are abusive to men. Just like perpetrators groom children, perpetrators of dependent adult abuse groom their victims too. And with a dependent adult, a lot of times it starts with something as easy as a smile. You know, and then it's usually, hey, hi Di, how are you doing? Whoa, somebody is smiling at me and they're calling me by my nickname, they're talking to me. And then it's touch, shake my hand, give me a tap, maybe a kiss on my cheek, a quick squeeze. You know, and touch has been absent for a long time. And then it's usually a gift, either candy or flowers. Hey, now I have a best friend. They smile at me and they call me by name and they touch me and they give me things. And the two times that are very, very dangerous to someone with a disability of all ages, one is bathing. And it doesn't matter whether it's an institution, a facility, or whether it's at home with home services. What we usually hear is, you know, Di, you'd sleep a lot better tonight if you had your bath in the evening than you had it in the morning. Hey, this is my best friend. I totally trust them. So we switched my bath to the evening when there's fewer visitors, fewer phone calls, lights are down, I'm nude. You know, and so they are very, very risk when they're talking about a bathing situation. Transportation is the second most dangerous time for them. What we usually hear, and it doesn't matter whether it is a city transit, cabs, private vehicle, a van, it doesn't matter. What we usually hear is, you know, Di, I know this is your home, or, you know, I know this is where I usually drop you off, but I have something I want to show you. Let's get everybody else home and then I'll show you. I don't even ask what. This is my best friend. Now I'm one-on-one with a perpetrator in a moving vehicle and high-risk situation when we're talking about bathing and transportation. Types of offenders. We talked about these are the same types as we talked about before, but sometimes we don't realize how easy it is to step over that line. My husband was 43. He had a heart attack and a stroke. I was a director of nursing at the time, so I had a very responsible job. We had 5 children under the age of 18 living at home. We had half the household income and a spouse 100% dependent on me for physical and mental. Every moment of every day, the stress was so high there, I had to watch what I said, I had to watch what I did. It would have been so easy to step over that line. As far as well-intentioned but ignorant, that one slide of the foot that I said we would address, he was a dependent adult, but the fact that he burned his own feet was his fault, not the fault of the caretaker. So he ran the bath water too hot. He stepped into hot bath water with both feet, burned his own feet, his problem. But the caretaker, being well-intentioned but ignorant, knew the burns needed to be kept clean, scrubbed them with Comet. Well-intentioned, ignorant caregiver. As far as someone being unwilling, could care less. I was doing orientation one day and there was this young man. We were doing orientation in my office. And he was tipped back with his chair on the last 2 legs. He had, his feet up on my desk. He had his arms crossed and had his eyes closed. And I took it for a few minutes and I finally said, "Excuse me, young man, am I boring you?" He said, "Lady, you're the most boring thing I have heard in my life." I was hot. It was a direct insult. But you know what I was really angry about? He had been hired. He had absolutely no business with any type of job in that type of a situation. He had no business working with dependent people. If he can't even sit still and pay attention in orientation, what's going to happen when he's out working with dependent adults? The abusive personality and the sadistic personality, these are exactly the same people for children as they are for adults. I already said we're going to find all 5 categories everywhere we find children, everywhere we find adults, potentially even in your work sites where you're working. The scariest news about especially the last 2 categories, they are very good caregivers. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, except that if they are reported as being abusive, and we have enough evidence, their name's going to be on the Central Abuse Registry for the next 10 years. It's part of a criminal background check. They will not be able to work with children or adults for the next 10 years. So who are they going to abuse? So they are very good caregivers to hide what they really want to do, which is to abuse our children and our dependent adults. There are 6 types of abuse with dependent adult abuse, and we're going to take them individually. When we're talking about physical abuse, physical injury, at variance with history, that one slide that I said was a fist directly to the chest, the dependent adult said she was taking her nap, and her caretaker came in, doubled up his fist, and came down full force onto her chest. Okay, the caretaker can't let that stand. He's just been accused of injuring her. So we had to make sure that we didn't believe what she said. I'm so sorry. She has Alzheimer's, it didn't happen that way. She was asleep and she rolled off her bed and she hit the back end of her shoe. I didn't hurt her. First of all, the lady didn't have Alzheimer's. But the other thing is you actually could see knuckle marks. So the story doesn't match. You're going to find that word omissions throughout all of these again. But in addition to that, we find more adults that are confined, locked up, tied up, caged than we find children. We're going to find medications used more often for control, either as a bribe or a punishment, or keep them quiet. A lot of times what we'll hear is, Di, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm not giving you your pain medication. Or, Di, if you do what I want you to do, I'll give you more pain medication. Or just keep me out of the way, keep me quiet, snow me. And when we're talking about physical abuse, it can go all the way into your assault categories, which is going to fall into criminal code. Same language that we talked about before. There's that willful neglects, omissions. But likewise, if in fact you are trained to do a job and you're not doing it the way you are trained to do, that's a breach of skill. That's a breach of the level of care that you are responsible for. That will fit under physical abuse. Something else that can potentially fit under physical abuse, under assault, would be verbal. So if you're being verbally abused, inappropriate language, threats, those type of things, that can actually fall under the physical injury, physical abuse category. This is the same scale for dependent adult abuse as it is for child abuse. Differences in different areas of abuse. Scratches, cuts, and bruises. Had a guy come into one of my programs one day. From collarbone to belt buckle, from shoulder to shoulder, he was a mass of perfectly symmetrical 1-inch slashes. He looked like he'd been in a fight with a razor blade and had lost the war. I didn't ask who did it. I didn't to have him tell me what had really happened. I just knelt down and said, "Can you tell me about this?" And he pushed himself back in his chair as far as he could get, and he said, "My son didn't do it. It's not abuse." Well, obviously it was abuse, and now I knew who had done it. Unfortunately, he was dead the next morning with massive internal injuries. The physician in the emergency room refused to get involved. He refused to file an abuse report. He put down the cause of death as cardiac arrest, and the son got away with murder. Scratches, cuts, and bruises. The categories between child and dependent adult abuse for burns are the same. Burns look like what were used. Gag marks are the same, all the way up. Hypothermia. Any of you that have dealt with frail adults, regardless of their age, you know that that's easy for them to get cold. My mother had died early on, and my father had remarried. He lived in Arizona, and I was down there visiting one August, and it was 112 degrees. I mean, it was hot. It was 2:30 in the afternoon, and my stepmother said to my dad, "Bill, do you think it's warm enough in here to turn off the furnace?" And it was like they had the furnace running in 112-degree weather because my dad was frail and was very, very cold. The same thing, dehydration, starvation. You saw the photos. The top of the next category, a detached retina. The number one cause of a detached retina in an adult is diabetes. It's not abuse. But the second cause of a detached retina in an adult is a direct blow to the head. Being tumbled out of a wheelchair, being whopped with a book, something there that's just that sudden harsh blow, just the same as the child that is being slammed. The problem's going to be, most of the time they're not going to be able to tell us, "I can't see, there's a problem with my eyesight." And so they're not going to get emergency surgery fast enough to preserve vision in one eye or both eyes. When we go all the way to the top with murder and death, there are police departments nationwide that are now starting to consider what they're calling gray murder. They're considering them as homicides. There are people that because their care is being neglected, that usually it's a urinary tract infection, a wound infection, pneumonia, where if they had had the right type of care or some consistent care, they would not have died. They are being considered homicides. I served as a consultant for a community once. The man was a dependent adult. His wife was his caretaker. She got tired of taking care of him. He was always wet and soiled because of early Alzheimer's, so she quit dressing him. She got tired of doing the laundry. So her husband spent 24 hours a day nude. She got tired of washing sheets and blankets, so she didn't make the bed. She put a plastic mattress pad on the cover, and she used kitty litter. It does everything the ads say. It's very, very absorbent. It's great for odor control. All she had to do was just scrape it up, throw it away, and put down new kitty litter. Can you imagine sleeping on kitty litter? She would take the dog out for a walk, and when she brought the dog back, she would leave a 3-foot leash attached to its collar. Now her husband, who sundowned with the Alzheimer's, he would pace, and his favorite place was the stairs, up and down. Man's best friend walked with him. Now if he trips and falls over a 3-foot leash, breaks his neck and dies, who are you going to blame? She would take 3- and 4-day little vacations. She wouldn't leave enough food or beverages, anything to drink in the house. Plus, man and dog were not out for walks. They weren't being cleaned up. The house was becoming a mess. It was during one of her little vacations that the community became aware that they had a problem. Her husband was hungry. He couldn't find anything to eat. He remembered that there was a building down the street that meant food. He couldn't remember Golden Arches. He couldn't remember McDonald's. He just knew it meant food, and he jimmied a window and he escaped. Now, if he had been wearing clothes, he could easily have become that statistic that wandered off and died. But instead, because he was nude, people noticed him within half a block at home. When they got him home, they found the locks on the outside of the house to lock the dog and him inside. That's when they found no clothes, the leash, the kitty litter, etc. But on the cabinet in the kitchen were multiple bottles of alcohol with all the lids gone. There were multiple bottles of prescription drugs for different patients, doctors, towns, pharmacies. She had been stealing and hoarding prescription drugs. All the childproof caps were gone, and next to that was an open box of rat poison. If he hadn't remembered McDonald's, which wasn't even down the street, if he hadn't jimmied a window, probably before she got back, he would have consumed a combination of two of those things. He would have died of either a cardiac or a respiratory arrest. His wife would have gotten home, got the place cleaned up before she called for help. He would not have been autopsied because of Alzheimer's, and she would have gotten away with murder. Sometimes it starts at the bottom, sometimes it starts at the top. Police departments like this scale. At least it gives them an idea of the different time frames, that rainbow effect of bruises. Medical professionals, we don't like it. We usually say, well, but what was the diagnosis? And well, what medications are they on? Trying to figure out, maybe it was something else that caused the problem. But just keep that rainbow effect in mind. You do have in your handout, you do have a complete body chart, full size. There are going to be times that if you take time just to draw it out, if you haven't made the decision to report, you're going to know that you have to. Some ways that I have seen it used. If you notice what's damaged compared to what isn't damaged, most of the damage is mid-chest, mid-back, up. This person was confined to a wheelchair. Their arms were being tied to the back of the wheelchair. They were being dragged up in bed, dragged up in the chair, so all the damage is from mid-chest and mid-back up. This was filled out by a medical professional, so for the most part it used medical terminology. No colors were used. But once it's drawn out, look at what's damaged compared to what isn't. Most of the body is damaged. Not a lot of damage, but a lot of rainbow. We've got yellow, purple, red, pale blue, gray, green, brown. But likewise, we have a stated time frame. They had fallen and hit the back of their head a month ago. They had cut their finger a week ago and it was infected. And so based on that, if you look at that chart and those time frames, it matches. And so even though it's a lot of controversy about the dating of bruises, in fact, it does come pretty close to that. I'm not sure if I would have had time to respond to this particular situation fast enough to save her. 5-generation family. She was an 82-year-old with severe Alzheimer's. The family were taking her for walks. They originally were doing a pretty good job of taking care of her. She fell in the mall in May, and she broke the bones of her hand and her wrist. They took her to the emergency room. The surgeon repaired the fractures and put her in a cast in May. It was now August. She had not been back to see the doctor since May. The only reason the family took her back that day, the infection under the cast was so bad, the smell bothered the family. Not what she was going through, the smell bothered the family. The only way that you can keep somebody in any type of an institution, a facility, is with a court order or a guardianship, if it's against their will. The only way you can take anybody out of any level of care against their will is a guardianship or a court order. And I never thought about getting an emergency court order. The doctor started the abuse report. He said, Di, take care of her. An hour and a half after we started taking care of her, her guardian, who was one of those 5-generation family members, came in and legally removed her from the hospital. Not only that, took her out of state. There was no follow-up. Chances of her living another 6 months was very, very slight. Sexual abuse for dependent adults, as far as part of the code, matches child abuse. The section 709, 726, those are the same that are in your handout on sexual abuse of children. It is the same criminal codes for adults as it is for kids. And the same subcategories, for the most part, are the same, including that invasion of privacy and nudity. Adults have that same right to have that privacy and that nudity. But there is a type of sexual abuse for dependent adults that we don't see in children, and that is sexual exploitation. And basically what that means is that you cannot be paid to do a job and have sex with the people you're paid to take care of. That seems to be a no-brainer, but it happens all the time. Until just 2009, this only pertained to health facilities with inspections and appeals. In 2009, it also pertains to community abuse. You cannot do a job, get paid to do a job, and have sex with the people you're paid to take care of. Okay? And so the other part of it that it was new in 2009 was electronic transfer images. Computer to computer, computer to cell phone to computer, cell phone, etc. That is against the law with sexual exploitation. We had a situation I'm aware of about a nursing facility that the nursing assistant was having sex with a 24-year-old with severe cerebral palsy. Now, he was quite capable physically of having sex. Okay, he was a dependent adult. Instead of following through legal channels when they became aware that there was a problem, they had terminated the employee. She was pregnant. She turned around and filed suit against the dependent adult to pay for child support. Fortunately, the judge in that case, a dependent adult, they don't have the money for it. Fortunately, the judge said, wait a minute, there's a problem here. It is her fault, not his. And so it does happen. It happens a lot more often than we really know about. 99% of the people with developmental disabilities have not had sex education. How are they going to tell us when there's a problem? We had a young man that said that somebody kept touching the thing that makes the water yellow. That's pretty good if you stop to think about it. If you don't, you just missed the fact that he was reporting sexual abuse. We had a young lady that kept saying somebody kept touching her pocketbook. And finally, the caretaker said, then leave it in your room. She wasn't talking about her purse. She was talking about her body. She'd been masturbating as a little kid, and the caretaker went, don't touch your pocketbook. Wrong education. She is explaining a situation to us. We had a young lady that said she was being raped at night by a caregiver. The people said that, how does she know? She's a retard. Inappropriate language. But in addition, if they had stopped to read her social history, they would have known that she was the victim of incest with her father from the time she was a tiny kid. She knew what had happened. She knew she had to report it. And so we're finding they haven't had the education. We have not given them the skills to make the report. And we know that people with developmental disabilities are abused the most often out of all categories of disability. Sex doesn't just happen. There's a thought process. Now, you can accidentally get pregnant, but you don't just accidentally have sex. But unfortunately, when we are talking about developmental disabilities, the tendency is to blame the victim, the survivor. It is their fault, rather than looking for the perpetrator and following through the way we should. When we're talking about sexual activity and frailty, so we're talking any 18 and over, there's a lot of additional problems to that. We already had said that we had lack of a good support system, so there isn't anyone really to kind of help them through those situations. I already talked about, especially women over the age of 75, and embarrassment with sexual activity. They're not used to telling us about anything like that with a sexual nature. The chances are they're not going to report abuse. And then when you're talking about problems as far as other illnesses, it's going to complicate existing illnesses. There's going to be more of a recovery period of time. There's going to be more tearing, more bruising, more infections. I've been a registered nurse for 42 years. Never once, when I had someone come in with a pelvic fracture or a hip fracture, never once did I consider sexual assault. But if you think about it, the perpetrator is usually younger, healthier, stronger, and on top. I just wonder how many we've missed that we didn't even consider it. Let's say that you're taking care of someone and they have a box of chocolate-covered cherries. And they say, hey, Di, would you like a chocolate-covered cherry? And I take one. That's okay. Unless my policies, my organization's policies are totally against that, I would be allowed to take a piece of candy because they offered. Okay, but say that they're in the other room or they're someplace with an activity and I help myself to a chocolate-covered cherry. Now I've stepped over the line. Okay, what about if I'm talking to them and they say, hey, Di, on your way home tonight, could you stop at Walmart and get me some shampoo? And they give me the money to buy the item. I go to the store. The next day I bring the shampoo back and I go to give them the change and they say, that's okay, keep the change. If I keep the change, I've broken the law. I know having 5 children, there are times I jokingly said we could only afford one shoe at a time because sometimes, those shoes, it was hard to pay for it. So if I was talking to a resident, to a client, and was talking to them about, how much shoes cost, if they hand me a 20 and say, I know this won't buy a pair of shoes, but I understand, this will help. If I take the money, I have broken the law. What about if I have a family member that says, Di, Mom really likes you. If you just treat her just extra special, just do the things that she wants, I'll slip you a little money each week. If I take the bribe, I've broken the law. You cannot, and once again, if you're paid to do a job, you cannot take extra benefits from the people that you are taking care of. The worst case I ever personally was involved with was a friend of mine. We worked together at the hospital. I was nursing supervisor. She was a nursing assistant. She had a lot of health challenges, so she had retired early. She had asked her best friend to be her power of attorney, and her best friend did a great job. Her best friend was not abusive at all. My friend's son lived in Colorado. He called the power of attorney, and he said he wanted some of Mom's money. The power of attorney said, I can't give it to you. Now, if you call your mom and ask her, if she calls me and tells me it's okay, I can give you the money. Instead of doing that, the son and his wife came back to Iowa, walked into Mom's house, grabbed her cat, slit its throat, and said, and if you don't change power of attorney to me, this is exactly what's going to happen to you. And she knew he meant it. She changed power of attorney to her son. They proceeded to lock her in a back bedroom. Until she got help, it was the last time she could have any visitors, last time she could have any phone calls. She knew that by the time her son sold everything she owned, she probably would end up like her cat. She told her son she was going to die if she didn't see the doctor. Knowing he hadn't sold the cash cow, he brought her to the emergency room. She knew that this had been my soapbox. As soon as she got to the hospital, she said, get a hold of Di, I'm in trouble. One of the biggest problems with adults and abuse, that I don't know of an adult that will file charges against their kids. It doesn't matter how bad our children are, we always have that hope that they'll change. I know that they'll change, it'll get better. Because she refused to file charges against her son, her attorney and law enforcement did something I'm not sure it even is legal. They put a restraining order for the entire state of Iowa. You get back to Colorado and you stay there. If you come across our border, we will arrest you regardless of what your mom has to say. For the next 6 years, Mom talked to her son on the phone, but she never saw him again, and she knew she was safe. See, financial exploitation, it is becoming the #1 crime for adults of all ages. It doesn't matter if they're dependent or not. So financial exploitation is a big problem. When we are talking especially in institutions, about any facilities, but it also can go with home situations, medications is becoming the #1 type of theft. There's a street value for most of the drugs we have, as well as personal usage for it. So medications is becoming a key component of financial exploitation. Denial of critical care for adults is basically the same as it is for children. It's denial of the basics. Okay, and there are two kinds. There is denial of the basics or denial of critical care by the caregiver. So that's the caregiver that's responsible for not doing what's required. The youngest abusive person I ever personally met was 4 years old. It was a situation that his mother had promised her mother, the little boy's grandmother, that she would never institutionalize her. Unfortunately, when she made that promise to her mom, she didn't know her mother was going to become an Alzheimer's victim, was going to set fire to an apartment complex and burn it down. Her mom would not have remembered the promise, but the little boy's mother remembered. And so the little boy's mom brought Grandma back to their house. The house was a 2-bedroom home with Mom, Dad, a newborn, and a 4-year-old. Where are you going to put Grandma? They moved the little boy out of his room. He had to sleep on the couch, but they left his toys and his clothes in the bedroom because it was only a 2-bedroom house. So he had to wait until Grandma got up and got out of his room before he could play. He had to wait till she got up and got out of his room before he could change his clothes. And he began to resent his grandmother. His mother would hear her mother go, "Ah, thud," and assumed that she was tripping, falling because of the diagnosis of Alzheimer's. It wasn't until one day as she was walking into the living room that she saw her 4-year-old hit, kick, and shove Grandma down, that she knew that they really had a problem. Because in that particular community, this has been my soapbox, she knew that. She asked if I would go with her to talk to the Department of Human Services. Because she's the one that discovered the problem, because she's the one that made the report that sought help for it, she was not going to be charged with either child abuse or dependent adult abuse. Had she ignored that situation and someone else had found out about it, she could have been charged with denial of critical care, dependent adult abuse. She could have been charged with denial of critical care, child abuse, because it was lack of supervision on both populations. And then we have a type of denial of critical care that we don't find in child abuse. That's self-denial of critical care. You saw the pictures. People have a right to live that way. Okay? There's only 2 times that we can really do anything about it. Number one, if the garbage is piling up or there's rodent infestation where it's a health issue, public health can temporarily remove that person from their home. They can be confused, disoriented, incompetent, but we only can remove them as a temporary fix. There isn't any finances or any money to do it. So usually you're talking about community action. Everybody steps in to help clean that place up again, and that person is allowed to go back home. Even if they're confused or disoriented, they have a right to live that way. The only time anything can be permanently done on that basis is if somebody takes the dependent adult to court, usually in a guardianship procedure. The judge looks at all the evidence and says they are legally adjudicated incompetent. Okay, so it's a legal ruling. At that point, the judge will say either that we have to get somebody in the home to take care of them, or if there isn't anyone available, they're going to have to be moved to a facility, usually a nursing facility, possibly assisted living, but most of them will end up going skilled care. Okay, that's a legal ruling. Sometimes family members will take that job on, that they'll say, Mom just isn't capable of living here anymore, and they will make that move. That's a legal issue. There's potentially some problems with that. The additional thing is a lot of times physicians will get involved and say, your mom just cannot live at home anymore. You've got to put her someplace. Once again, there's a potential for some legal issues with that because the judge has not had that legal thing, that legally adjudicated incompetent. If it's covered under durable power of healthcare decisions or a living will that, to my daughter, when I get to be in this state, I know I need to be moved, that probably would cover it, but just tread lightly. Make sure if you're going to be involved in that type of a situation, know what the legal rights are, both for the dependent and for yourself. I started out saying that I am a registered nurse, but I'm not a mandatory reporter. The Department of Human Services has always had the dependent adult abuse law and the child abuse law. Okay, and their definition of a mandatory reporter is, in the course of employment, if you examine, attend, counsel, or treat a child or a dependent adult, you are a mandatory reporter. That has always been the law. And so then based on that, I'm not a mandatory reporter because I never know how old any person is. I could very easily be dealing with a 17-year-old. I don't know what age people are, and I don't know who have disabilities, who are dependent based on the levels of care. So I'm not a mandatory reporter based on employment. Okay, we'll talk about permissive in a moment, but okay, sometimes people will say, well, I'm a mandatory reporter because I'm on call. No, just being on call doesn't make you a mandatory reporter. It's when you're back in that employment situation, when you are responding to a situation, that you are mandatory. If you do phone counseling, if you have a hotline and you do phone counseling, that would be still on the phone. As soon as you're interacting with a child or dependent adult, you're back into counseling, you're back as a mandatory reporter. When you're off duty, you are not mandated to report. I absolutely love Halloween. And I was walking through this store in October, and I found absolutely the coolest thing. It was this mummy, and it's like 4.5 feet tall, and the top of its head was gone. But it was too big. It didn't fit in my cart. So I tucked it under my arm, and I'm walking through the store pushing my cart. And this lady comes flying out of the clothes, and she's right in my face, and she's yelling at me. She's pointing her finger at me. All of a sudden, she backed off, and she said, "I am so sorry. I'm a mandatory reporter of child abuse, and I thought you were dragging your grandson by his head." Well, first of all, this is a store. She's not a mandatory reporter. She's just making an assumption that she is. In addition, last time I checked, all my grandkids had the tops of their heads. So those perceptions are being made. Okay, course of employment. And then part of the law, the Department of Inspections and Appeals have always considered staff as mandatory reporters. The definition of staff, everyone that is employed. Okay, that's really always been their definition. Now, because they have their code section that was written, it was Chapter 235E, like an elephant, in 2008. The administrative rules were passed in December of 2009. All staff of medical center hospitals, nursing facilities, assisted living, adult group homes, adult daycare are all mandatory reporters and are mandated to have the training and to report. So the person that mows the lawn, that does the laundry, that does the health care are all mandated to report. So there's a push on to get everybody trained, and there are some specific deadlines to do that. You have to have mandatory reporter orientation to abuse within the first 30 days of employment. You have to have it